Hello, everybody. My name is Leit Abdelbari, and I am a senior here at Shoreditch High School. Today, we are going to be interviewing Ryan Robinson, a mentor of mine, and attends the Unitarian Universalist Church of Indianapolis on the Butler Tarkington area. I'm a part of that community as well. I'm going to go ahead and read his bio. So, Ryan Robinson is the current director of human resources for WFYI here in Indianapolis. WFYI is a nonprofit organization that for the last 50 years has provided trusted news and quality entertainment through its association with National Public Radio and PBS. Before coming to WFYI, he spent a year as the head of education and learning for a credit union and 8 years in human resources with Whole Foods Market. He has spent the last 12 to 15 years working the human resources profession after going to graduate in school in American history with an interest in the creation of whiteness and eugenics in America. In his spare time, he loves to run and found the pandemic in 2020 particularly great for getting outside for a run daily. He also has far too many vinyl records. He is delighted to be asked to participate and looks forward to telling us about how handsome his dog is. Okay. So I guess we'll get right into some of the questions about what WFYI is and why is it important for our community.
Sure. Thank you again. I'm delighted to be here. I spoke with Sarah, who helped coordinate some of this, and the first time they reached out and said, we'd like to talk about world changers. And I was like, whoa, that feels mildly uncomfortable having the word world changer attached to me, but I'm happy to be here and happy to be asked. WFY, for those that don't know, as I had in the bio, because I thought I should at least give a little bit of a definition, is a nonprofit entity that is directly tied to giving free over-the-air news and entertainment, and you know, in 2020 has taken on some of the aspects of helping to educate as so many young folks have transitioned to educating virtually and remotely. PBS has stepped into some of that gap and has tried to assist some of these educators who appear to be very taxed from my perspective with doing some of the education or assisting those parents who are also trying to work full-time jobs. NPR is most frequently associated with trying to give an unbiased news perspective. And I don't think it's a surprise in this day and age that we seem to find ourselves in a space where so much discourse has become very inflammatory and folks have kind of moved to individual sides that are a little bit further on the spectrum, or at least America perceives it that way. It probably looks a little bit differently to folks overseas where there are so many different representative parties and different spaces for you to plug in. But NPR tries to cover the news and as in an unbiased way as possible while giving kind of a full representation of thinking about arts and entertainment, sports, which isn't necessarily NPR's specialty if you've ever listened to NPR, politics and government, and trying to allow folks to be able to have a bit more of a nuanced perspective and some longer form interviews. And there's, as we find ourselves in kind of a golden age of radio with podcasting, there's lots of different ways that you can plug into different stations around the United States. Just through like picking up your phone and listening to the San Francisco station or the Seattle station, you can find out about news that both feels local and national at the same time. I hope that helped.
Yeah, definitely. I do think that in today's age where there's so much fake news circulating on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram, you know, listening to NPR sometimes can feel a little bit good because I know that they're funded, or they used to be funded by the government, and that was kind of like a way of saying, hey, we're trying to be bipartisan here. But as they, you know, that whole fallout with Pompeo, I don't know who it was, like, you know, time over time that kind of changed. Thank you for sharing that, though. That's very important for our community to get, you know, quality, objective news. But that kind of leads us to the next question, which is like, what do you do? What is human resources in the corporate world and nonprofit, and specifically with WFYI, because usually you see it as kind of like a white collar job, which means it's like for the privileged and it high paying, maybe mid paying. But like, what do you do?
That's a good question. I suppose other colleagues and I sometimes say that we get to function like the therapists of organizations on some of our worst days. But on your best days, you get to see, a person start out with very little connection to what you do. And then 5 years later, you're seeing them promoted and they're really connected and growing. So I guess I'll describe kind of how I fell into doing human resources. That probably gives the best answer at some level. And then I'll talk maybe just about what I might do on a weekly basis. I kind of fell into it because it's almost like I would say a synergy or an amalgam. I'm trying to think of a better word, but it kind of brings together some of the things I was specifically interested in. So I really loved the aspect of teaching and learning. I'm kind of a lifelong learner, which I think in the past has been a tagline of NPR or PBS. So I guess that's a natural fit. But I find myself in the space where I'm a lifelong learner. I like knowing a lot about how an organization functions. And I both like people and sometimes I don't like people at the same time. Like I find myself to be an extroverted introvert, like a situational extrovert, but I do feed off the energy of kind of collaborating with folks and getting the opportunity to bounce ideas off of people. And in human resources, you tend to do all of those things on a daily basis. Your work is almost never repeatable. Which I found myself working for 4 years while my wife was first going to college and my daughter, who's now almost 23, was born. I worked at Subaru in Lafayette for 4 years, and there you're just repeating the same things, and I found that to be incredibly dreadful. So a space that allows for some sort of creativity worked out really well for me. And on a daily basis, just for example, this morning before I got on this call, I was working on posting a position for us that we're hiring an equity reporter who's going to be focusing in on equity reporting as it's associated with health outcomes, which is a partnership with us and the Indianapolis Recorder here in the city. The Recorder is the longest serving African-American publication in Indianapolis, and we're doing a shared reporter between the two of us. So I just posted that job this morning. If you look on the website, you'll find it. If you know somebody, feel free to have them apply. But I posted a job. I was talking to some folks about, I'm rewriting our handbook. So I was having a discussion with the CEO. He and I are working on it together, and we have a deadline at the end of this month. I had a couple of questions about some grants that our grant coordinator or our grant writer was working on. And then I was also working on some longer term planning for this whole year that we as an organization, we carved out a large section of, well, not a large section, but we carved out a substantial amount of money in our budget for an ongoing basis to kind of facilitate from an organizational wide perspective doing ongoing continuous training in diversity, equity, inclusivity, and belonging. This was a discussion we started having in 2019, but of course was exacerbated or given extra momentum, by the murder of George Floyd or some of the protests we saw in our city. So there's a little bit that you can do in all different parts of the job. Since I'm essentially kind of a department of one because WFY has just around between 80 and 100 employees. I count some of our contractual folks or some of our freelance folks as people working with us. As you get into larger organizations, of course, you can specialize. As I said, when I worked at a credit union, which was an odd fit for me, and that's probably why I only decided to be there for a year. I was specifically just the head of training and education for the organization. So all I did every week was I came up with trainings, I wrote curriculum, I did instructional design, like where I would design courses that we would do, and I just trained folks and interacted with them there. You can do things where you just do payroll, which sounds terrible, but you can just do
So
payroll. So
that
yeah,
that
you can do a little bit of everything with HR, and it allows you the flexibility to kind of figure out what you have as a specialty, but it allows you to interact with everybody in the organization. During the past year, I've talked to every single employee that we've had, where sometimes if you're just managing a team, you just talk to that team.
Yeah. So that kind of like brings me. We have to do this very quickly. We're running out of time here, but that kind of brings me to the.
That's my fault. I give very long-winded answers.
You're okay. That kind of brings me to like values. So I would like you to list maybe, let's say, I don't know, 3 values that you have that you try to incorporate on a daily basis in your
Yeah.
life work. So
Yeah, I think for me, kind of the notion of talking about, diversity, equity, inclusivity, and belonging, like those are, if you put those together as one bundle, those are incredibly important to me. They're not always exactly a match for how corporations or organizations like to function. I think that will become more prevalent as more folks like some of the younger folks that we're talking to today are brought up with some of those values as American society is changing slightly. I would say that may be more important as we enter the workforce in the future, and organizations are going to have to figure out ways to adapt to that. Uh, I'm a big believer that folks that work in organizations like to understand the why. So I'm a big believer that transparency and open communication are really important for an organization. So in that sense, like the more often we can tell the people that we work with the truth as best as we can, um, like they're going to be more connected to us because they're going to trust us, and they're going to believe that we have their best interest at heart. And so as much as possible, trying to figure out ways to be inclusive as a culture, and not just like say that you're doing it, be open and communicate with people, and try to be transparent and vulnerable. Like we don't always have the answers. There are times that I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing. Um,
yeah,
and it's okay to tell that to somebody and ask for help and go, I have no idea what I'm doing. And that's never been more true in this past year, as like, at no point during any of my 25 years of working did I ever think I'd be trying to figure out ways to make a building accessible to folks in the middle of a worldwide global pandemic. Like we were all just making it up last year, and we're still making it up now, as to how we're
sure.
working. So being transparent and vulnerable and open, let people know that, that's okay. Like that's all right. That's going to happen.
So before we end, because we're doing that pretty soon, I do have a couple of questions. But before we address those questions from the Q&A chat,
Sure.
I want to talk about like some hobbies of yours. Totally
Sure.
has nothing to do with human resources, but I feel like there could be some form of connectedness between maybe what you love to do, which for you it was history in university, and like I know you love music, so talk about that.
Sure. This is, I guess, that part of, for me, the part of studying history was I'm a big believer that um, history as it's written now tends to reflect the time period that you're in, even when you're writing about something that's 400 years ago.
Yeah.
It's hard to not have kind of the values of what's going on in the society around you. And so as you read historical books that fall into different decades in America or in the world, they're kind of reflective of the values of those people that existed at that time. So I think it's incredibly important to kind of know where we were to know where we're going. So for me, it's also how I think about the organization, is that I'm always trying to figure out how you get to kind of the root cause of what the problem is, or try to figure out what is the actual issue that we're facing. So the notion of history doesn't seem particularly related to human resources. That sometimes I often joke when I'm interviewing people like, and of course I do human resources because I have a degree in history. It tends to help out in some of the investigative aspects of what I do, or it helps out in some of the research or kind of the learning. And then in terms of music, I guess I think about arts and culture in this way, is that it allows us to be kind of more empathetic and understanding. Music is just, I like music, but I'm thinking about the arts overall in general. They give us a sense of kind of connection with our fellow humans, and it gives us a shared space of understanding. We become more empathetic, and we become more understanding the more we're able to learn about what other people do and how they function. And so I'm always in favor of as much kind of arts and culture and empathy and understanding as possible, because I truly do think that it helps make for a better community, a better country, a better discourse, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. So I'm going to go ahead and move on because we have a lot of questions from, the Q&A chat. But what advice do you have for any student who might be interested in working in the nonprofit sector?
Sure. I tend to say, if you're thinking about getting a career, or you're thinking about a job, I'm a big believer that people quit jobs, but people don't quit careers. And I'll define that really, really quickly to be like, you should seek out something that is a really deep connection to your own personal values. People tend to like connecting with something that they believe in the mission of the organization. Of course, we can't always do that right as we start out working, but I would always suggest that you continue to seek out working for organizations, or thinking about working for organizations that you feel comfortable telling someone at the grocery store that you work there, and that there's like a sense of you feeling proud that you do that, or that you believe in what the organization does. Because when work gets hard and work gets boring or work gets terrible or you're working too much, you can fall back on the fact that you believe you're making a difference in the world, or you can fall back on the fact that you believe in the mission of the organization. If you don't do that and work gets really hard, you just work a really terrible job, and you'd probably want to go do something else. So, I mean, as much as possible, the fact that you are able to get an education and able to find things that you're passionate about, or able to go to college if you choose to do that, or find it's a good fit for you, seeking out those organizations that do that is going to be your best bet.
Thank you for that answer. That was actually really awesome. When it comes to the connectedness you have with, your work, it's kind of like that, like you were saying earlier, synergy, that connectedness that you have with purpose, and that balance between your livelihood and things like that. We have another one. We had some students ask about your graduate program. What does it mean to study whiteness?
Sure. I guess I would point you all to a really great book by Neil Irvin Painter that talks about the creation of whiteness. But there's a big belief, of course, that race is a social construct, which just means like we chose to make it up, or that time's a social construct. We created a 24-hour day because it structured us around work. And so I looked specifically at the kind of creation of whiteness in early 20th century America, like how, as a new wave of immigrants entered the country that weren't from Northern Europe and were Italians and Greeks and Hungarians and et cetera, that those folks weren't white at the time, but they became white. I studied why that happened, and I looked at both eugenics, which, the notion that people most frequently associate with the Nazis, but they took a lot of their ideas from some of the policies we had in America and actually came to study in our country in the 20s, of like restricting folks from breeding. And I also looked at euthenics, which is the positive version of that, of just saying, who should we have breeding? And there were a lot of those policies in place in the early 20th century in America that tried to encourage people that had really good genes to make babies, and people that didn't have really good genes to not make babies. It's a room clearing topic. when you bring it up in like mixed company. So like if you really want to clear a room or not have a conversation with somebody, you could just be like, oh, I studied eugenics, and people are like, that's cool, I'm going to leave now. So it's not like a fun, casual topic of conversation generally.
I mean, I enjoy those conversations because it allows us to understand a lot of like the history behind the United States and how, our entire system of justice, of, things that really affect us on a daily basis, but we have been blinded by, I don't know, for example, media or propaganda, right, in some form or the other. I think eugenics gives us a light in that path and allows us to see, hey, everything was constructed against the brown and black person, and the impoverished and the poor. So we have another one, but I'm thinking, like, how can you relate your position at your job to that position in other jobs? You kind of touched on that when it comes to like the nonprofit question, but how is your job at WFYI different than perhaps a normal human resources job?
I would say the nonprofit sector, as a person who worked, almost for a decade in the corporate sector of thinking about Whole Foods Market doing something similar. I certainly, and I am the department of one, so I report directly to the CEO, and we meet weekly. So, I do have somebody that's kind of overseeing my work, but I get a lot of opportunity to be more flexible and to be a little bit quicker in responding or pushing us as an organization in a direction we might want to go to. But that would be true of almost any entity that was a little bit smaller. I think it really is just an economies of scale. As an organization gets significantly larger and exponentially larger, there's a lot more structure, which is both good and bad. Like, structure allows you to know what you can do and can't do, and allows you to be successful within kind of the box that you have. And it allows you some flexibility in that, like, I do this one thing, but if you're looking for something that allows you to have a lot of creativity and a lot more flexibility, I would say that I've often found that the smaller an organization is, there of course becomes the opposite when it's just like an organization of 4 people. There's not really a lot of flexibility there because it's like there's 4 of you. But there's kind of this sweet spot, I think, that exists somewhere, and I don't know exactly where it is, maybe between 50 and 250 people in an organization, where you feel like sometimes you can really like make a difference or make a change. And sometimes as the organization gets larger, you can't really make a change. You're for lack of a better word, to think about a phrase from Berkeley in the 60s, like you're just a cog in the machine of like how the organization's functioning. Like you're just a piece of how that whole thing is working.
Interesting metaphor. Yeah. So we have a question about high school, and
Sure.
Personally, I've never asked you this question. I don't think of 6 years I've known you, but like, what were you like in high school? What were some things that happened to you in high school?
I wasn't cool. I don't know if I'm still cool now. I feel like that's probably not the case. In high school, I went to high school in Chesterton, Indiana, which is in Northwest Indiana. I like to describe Chesterton as the Zionsville of Northwest Indiana, to give you a frame of reference for what the city might be like.
Gracious.
Also Chesterton, just for a fun fact, and this can be a topic you can all look up later, it was a sundown town in Indiana, which Indiana had a lot of towns that restricted access to African-American folks throughout its history. But it was a large school. I had a class of about 500. This isn't going to be surprising. I was what you would describe as like a very nerdy person. So I had lots of honors classes and AP classes, and I wasn't particularly cool. And I worked a job, which seems funny now as a person who hasn't eaten meat in like 20 years. I worked at making food at a ribs place for like 2 years. So, I did the same things you typically do in high school, in that I played basketball, I went outside. I guess it was your normal kind of terrible high school experience, and that I don't have particularly fond memories of like middle school and high school, where some people say they look back and go, that was the best years of our lives. I tend to think the years I'm living now are the best years of my life. I guess that was my experience. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that. I didn't mean to bring up any trauma if I did.
No, you did not. Thank you, though.
Okay.
I appreciate your empathy.
Thank you. So we have an interesting question here. We kind of talked about human resources and how it changes the news, but really quickly, like 30 seconds, how has it changed the news? And specifically from your perspective in human resources, how have you seen it happen?
I mean, I would say that human resources tends to be the driver of in most organizations of things like training or education of the staff. So if human resources convinces an organization or works with an organization to say that we're going to focus in on things like, the fact that I brought up diversity, equity, inclusivity, and belonging, that means that the folks inside that organization, whether they choose to or not, are probably receiving some of that, or the culture of the organization is moving in that direction to become more open to some of those concepts.
Yeah,
that inevitably makes the entire organization move in that direction. And if all the organizations are doing that at once, that is going to change society. It just will.
Yeah.
I mean, I believe in the changing power of education and openness and connectedness with others. And so if human resources is helping to facilitate that in an organization, it can be, for lack of a better word, it can be world changing.
So
boom, we got there.
Yes. So do you think like with a union, for example, I don't know if WFYI is unionized, but like
we are not, but there are other public radio stations that are unionized.
Okay. So like in that sense, how would you collaborate with the workers? Because a union is a representation of workers to the CEO, administration, rich people that basically run the organization. And, sometimes there's a lot of inequality, right? Specifically, we see the injustices, more statistically speaking, to brown, Black people, people of color, who have, faced systematic oppression throughout the years. So like, how has your collaboration with that at WFYI in response to the news, like how have you seen that happen with other organizations?
I would like to start off with nobody in public media is getting super rich.
That's true. That's true.
So I do want to point that out, that nobody's getting that Bezos cash. But I suppose it's a little bit different. I think when some people think about unions, they tend to think about the kind of the adversarial nature that exists between, executives and the working class, or if you want to use other phrases like the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, of the workers and the owners of capital. But there's the space, I would say, that's a little bit different, and that we don't have a union. And I also think this is true at organizations that are smaller, or in the difference between a nonprofit union and a for-profit union, and that often, especially in a space where you're thinking about public media, like it is a mission-driven organization versus a capital-driven organization. So folks are tending to want to work there if they continue to stay working there because they believe in the mission of the work, and everybody believes in the mission of the work. So there is at least that kind of sense that you're pulling in the same direction. But just in terms of thinking about how we've responded to news, maybe in this past year or the past few years, I mean, really, you're responding with, empathy and at your best. You're responding with empathy and kind of a space to have open dialogue. I would say that we as an organization have tried to create more spaces where we're having open dialogue about the challenges we're all facing. So mental health issues are real this year during the pandemic. We're in a new year. So we've spent a lot of time as an organization, like just talking about that. I realize that there are members that are colleagues of mine or members of the staff who aren't taking enough time off. Even though they have the time off, like what's the point of taking time off when you're stuck at your house? So trying to encourage folks to take time off to recharge from work. So we've been encouraging, adding in some additional holidays or setting time for mandatory time off from work, or, I'll reach out to somebody and go, you've been working 2 consecutive months. I need you to take, like, not, they're getting weekends off, but like encouraging them to take time off work, or, creating time for us to have conversations about how we all felt in late May and June when we saw, I don't know why George Floyd was the breaking point for society and why it wasn't, Rodney King in 1992 getting beaten on camera by 4 police officers who never faced any repercussions. Why it was like 28 years later, here we are, and another person gets murdered by law enforcement on camera.
I'm just kidding.
But that disproportionately affected, members of our staff. Like, there were many articles written at the time saying, like, check in on your folks that work with you that are people of color. They're not doing okay. And that was true. They weren't doing okay. They hadn't been doing okay before, but they weren't doing even more okay now, grammar. And so creating some space for us to have those conversations and kind of reflect on how that was impacting them. Like, sure, ultimately I'm the human resources person for an organization, but I'm also a human being. And like, whether or not it's impacting their job, I just want to have people feel okay about their lives, and treat them like human beings. So I
think
I rambled. There wasn't really a good answer in there. I don't have a great answer, but I feel like with openness and communication, you can solve a lot of problems. I tend to have a very, very, very positive view of human beings. Sometimes I figure I'm wrong, but I tend to have a very positive view of humans, and that I believe most, this will answer your question in one sentence. I believe that most things that are like clashes or disagreements at work are really just a clash of personal values and people not explaining like how their values are not aligning with someone else's values. And the more we're able to have a space of openness to talk about like what your values are, I believe that most people aren't setting out to like be a bad worker or treat people disrespectfully or say things that are bad or harass people. I tend to believe that like 99.9% of people just have a sense of ignorance. And if you communicate with them and explain to them why something isn't what they should be doing, that they'll respond in a really positive manner because they're good people and they want to be good people and they just want to do a good job.
I think that incentive makes sense overall. I mean, we see a lot of inequality just in general. You kind of touched on this, and we are technically over time, but I'm going to take 1 extra minute because this question is very important to me and to people in the audience, since we're talking specifically to a majority minority school, right? How, as a white person yourself, right, how would you address racial injustice in the workplace and in the United States in general? And then let's make this very brief, maybe like a minute, and then we'll wrap it up.
I'm going to skip the America question because that we could spend the next 7 hours talking about that. And I'll just talk about how I try to do it at work, which is to try to think about recognizing that I'm in a space of privilege and that I've benefited from the fact, with maybe no fault of my own, I've just benefited from being a middle-aged white male. Like, structures are set up for my benefit. So as much as possible, trying to look at things from a human resource perspective, like, in terms of our hiring, we've looked at moving towards, when we're interviewing folks, of having a minimum of 2 minority candidates in the interview pool. Studies show that once you move from 1 to 2 candidates in the pool, your chances of hiring a candidate that is diverse exponentially increase.
Yep.
Looking at things like having blind resume reviews. Again, studies show that people, whether intentionally or not, discriminate against names that don't fit into the statistical norm of like white male society. Or looking at things about having salary transparency, where you have salaries that are public and people understand where they fall into those wages so that they can have a good space of negotiation. And that, you know, traditionally the wage structure is set up to discriminate against folks that are different, that don't understand that you could negotiate for salary, or where they might fall into that wage band, or removing things, you know, like banning the box about whether or not you've ever had a felony on job applications, because that tends to discriminate against folks that are, you know, people of color. I'll stop there. But those are just like a few examples you could think of that you could do within an organization. Being a person who is a white male, I suppose I should say this is the very last thing. You could listen. You could just listen. I don't need to assume that I have the answers. Often the white man gets to assume he has the answers and his answers are the right answers. We could just listen. We could listen to folks that are having a lived experience and take their advice, and do our best to move in the direction of, you know, following what they tell us they'd like to see the organization look like, and try to work with them to move the direction of the organization towards them, whoever they may be.
Thank you for that response. That was really good. I want to say thank you so much, Ryan, for, you know, introducing this pragmatic and practical realm to our students, because we're going to have a lot of issues after, especially for seniors, juniors, with finding jobs, probably if they want to go into college, especially after that, and knowing that human resources is a viable option. You, as Ryan here, clearly, you don't have to major in anything specifically to go into it, just probably experience is necessary. And, you know, it's very practical. It's pretty good wages. I would say probably what, 50K starting out, 40K. You could get
Depending,
going. Yeah. And, you know, I just wanted to introduce that to our students, and also knowing that it works for the non-for-profit, it works for profit, and overall it's, you know, a very viable option for work. So I wanted to introduce that, and thank you so much for mentioning, you know, your perspective on racial justice and, you know, society in general as well, and integrating that with your work. Yeah, I think that's it.
Well, thanks everybody. I know that you've probably also all figured out now that I struggle sometimes with being succinct. So I appreciate that we went a little bit over. It's just, I sometimes have trouble when the questions are like very nuanced. You could probably also figure out I like to discuss things and like think about all the different perspectives. So I appreciate some of the questions. I see that there's so many questions that we didn't answer. I'd be happy to answer some of those or offer myself for contact later if you want. I believe Sarah has my email address. So if she wants to share that and folks want to reach out, I'd be happy to set up individual calls or to email you if you have questions about something that you didn't get answered. I'd love to make myself available.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Ryan. Yeah, I think we're going to end it here. Bye-bye.
All right. I appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Yep.
All right.